Hello, and welcome to our community forum. I'm Dr. Linda McCammon, the director of the Ethics Minor Program and an associate professor in the Religious Studies Department at St. John Fisher College. Today we're going to delve into the thought of the great moral philosopher and economist Adam Smith. Often cited as the father of modern economics, Smith's most famous and influential work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, has been studied and debated by economists, ethicists, politicians, and students since its publication in 1776. In this work, Smith references the famous concept of the invisible hand, which many free market advocates have used to justify laissez-faire capitalism. But in recent years, their interpretation of the invisible hand and Smith's work as a whole has been increasingly challenged by many scholars. We are fortunate to have one of these scholars here with us today. Dr. Jonathan Wight is a professor of economics at the Robbins School of Business at the University of Richmond. Jonathan received his master's and doctoral degrees from Vanderbilt University. He has published extensively on the work of Adam Smith, and one of these works will be the focus for our discussion today. It's a novel entitled Saving Adam Smith, A Tale of Wealth, Virtue, and Transformation. And welcome, Dr. Wight. Jonathan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, and as an economist, I thought it was fascinating that you were very interested in Adam Smith's ethics. And so I guess my first question to you is where and how did you get interested in ethics?
Well, thank you so much for having me, first of all, and thanks to St. John Fisher College and to Claire Smith and to Tim Madigan for all of you for this wonderful hosting you've done to me over the last couple of days. It's been really wonderful visiting your students. In graduate school, I heard rumblings or innuendos about Adam Smith, that he was a philosopher before he was an economist. But in graduate school, and I think it's probably true still today, when I was in graduate school in the 70s and 80s, early 80s, economists were not reading Adam Smith. They were not reading The Wealth of Nations except for a few snippets that were taken out of context. And I had acquired The Wealth of Nations in a yard sale somewhere.
Is that right?
And but I'd never read it. And then in 1995, I was in a Borders bookstore one evening, and I just happened to go to the econ section, of course. I was drawn there. And there was a Liberty Fund edition of The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Those of you who may not know, the Liberty Fund is a wonderful organization that tries to republish great works, and they have conferences around the country. And they had taken a new edition that had just come out for the bicentennial of the Wealth of Nations. Glasgow University, along with Oxford University Press, had produced some really magnificent 6-series volume of Adam Smith's collected works.
Oh, really?
And they were publishing, so Liberty Fund took the copyright to that and was publishing these books in the United States in a high-quality paperback for the magnificent sum of $7.50 for The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So I was in the bookstore and I saw The Theory of Moral Sentiments and I thought, well, I'll never read it, but I've got The Wealth of Nations, so I might as well buy his other book, Theory of Moral Sentiments. I took it home and I thought, it was about 10 o'clock at night. I'll never forget this. It was about 10 o'clock and I thought, well, I'm not going to read this book, but I'll just at least open it and read a few pages. And then I couldn't put it down. It was so engrossing and so engaging, and it grabbed me in a way that I couldn't let go of it. And so another colleague at my university, Dr. Clarence Jung, and I started a reading group on the Theory of Moral Sentiments. We had 12 faculty from business and liberal arts and religion get together, and we spent a year going through Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Is that right? What a wonderful idea.
It was really nice, and it was fortunate that there were philosophy professors and a religion professor who knew a lot about the Enlightenment and were able to help me.
Excellent.
And I had a sabbatical coming up. And so I thought I really would like to try to understand this concept of Adam Smith's ethics more broadly. And as I was going off on my sabbatical, the dean at the time pulled me aside and said, "You're an economist. Why are you wasting your time on ethics?" This is literally a true story. So when people talk about tenure and the meaning of tenure, it's an institution that allows ideas to percolate without top-heavy people interfering too much.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm really grateful I live in a society where we have institutions of higher learning where you are free to pursue your passion, and it may be that you end up in wrong avenues, but the hope is that, and the faith is that enough people will end up in the right avenues that something good will happen from this.
Well, you clearly are a very creative person, because one of the things that struck me was that not only do we have an economist who's really delving into Adam Smith's ethics, but the way you approach it is quite unique. The book that we have, the novel, it's a novel. And so in itself, that's very novel. So could you sort of talk to us about why did you decide to use a novel, that whole meeting, the whole idea of writing a novel about Adam Smith, to try to educate people about him?
Well, it's kind of a long story. I knew I wanted to write about Smith, and I really wanted to reach students. I wanted to reach lay people. I wanted to reach people who didn't have a heavy background in economics. So I couldn't use a conventional medium. And Adam Smith, when he talked about ethics, said, don't learn your ethics in a philosophy class.
Yes.
He actually said the best way to learn ethics is through literature, through the arts, through drama, through ways in which you get to see characters behaving badly. And out of sympathizing with the hurts that are caused and so on, that you can begin to develop a moral sympathy with some of these characters, and you can begin to develop a more moral understanding in your own life. As for the specific choice of the medium of a novel, a friend of mine who's at George Mason now, Russ Roberts, had written a really interesting economics novel called The Choice. And it's about David Ricardo, and he brought David Ricardo back to life to talk about free trade. And I loved that book, and I used it in my classes. And there have been a lot of other economists writing novels, Death on Demand, and about Keynesian economics. So the idea to write a novel actually wasn't new with me, but I thought it would be something I'd like to explore, and it was the hardest thing I've ever written. I'd written other books, and this was by far the hardest thing to do. And so I had to rely on editors and lots of readers, had to rely on my students. One of my students gave me the title for the book. I previously had a title, On the Road with Adam Smith. The book is really a road trip with Adam Smith, and I had a previous title, but another student gave me this title, and I ran with it. I really loved it.
Why saving Adam Smith? What is it about this book where you feel as though you're saving Adam Smith?
I think Adam Smith has been badly misunderstood in the 20th century. In the 20th century, economists were trying to narrow down their focus of understanding. And in order to do that, you have to simplify. And so they threw out a more serious, sophisticated view of the human person, and they narrowed everything down to homo economicus, which would be a selfish maximizer. And in a way, that's useful to do. The modeling becomes much simpler. But you really miss a richness, and we are discovering now that in experiments that humans can't be pigeonholed in that way. What makes a good society is that we have humans who are not only self-interested, but they are other-regarding. They're interested in others in both good ways and bad ways. And out of this mix of instincts, we get a system of justice, we get a system of commerce that works. And so I think it is dangerous to pigeonhole people than saying everybody is a selfish maximizer. And when you read the Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, in both of those, Smith is passionate about trying to see humans in a much different light. Smith, for example, attacks Bernard Mandeville, who was a Dutch philosopher who had written The Fable of the Bees. And in that book, in that poem, Mandeville claims that everybody is selfish and selfishness will lead to good outcomes. That's the great misinterpretation of the invisible hand. The idea that if everybody just seeks to maximize their own self-interest, that magically society's best interest will somehow flow from that. And Smith attacks that point of view quite explicitly. He feels that we have to have self-control, that we can't just have everybody doing whatever they want to do and think that that's going to magically produce the best outcomes. So in the 20th century, a misinterpretation of the invisible hand took root. And we see this in the sayings of Ivan Boesky, who said that greed is good. And in the movie Wall Street, where greed is good. So I wrote the book, Saving Adam Smith, to bring him back to life and to use his words to try to flesh out why greed isn't good, why we have to have a slightly more sophisticated view of the human person so that we can have a marketplace where freedom can reign, where we don't have to have big government, and people learn to regulate their own behaviors in consideration of justice and fairness to others.
So, and I understand what you're saying, that they took what they kind of cherry-picked Adam Smith, and from that they came up with this idea that free markets mean that you can basically do anything you want, and that somehow greed is good. Now, could you sort of clarify, because Smith does talk about self-interest, but self-interest is very different from greed, and he really does talk about that. So could you clarify that concept of self-interest within Adam Smith's work?
Absolutely. So Adam Smith is a virtue ethicist in the sense that he believes that we have to create persons who are balancing different interests in a way. And it is virtuous to be prudent. We do have to look after ourselves, because if we're not looking after ourselves, then somebody else is going to have to look after ourselves, whether government or others. And if you are able, you should look after yourself, that you are the person most responsible for your own well-being. So prudence is an important virtue. And that's where I think we run into a little bit of problem, because we see prudence as being everything. But prudence is part of a whole system of virtues, and we can't just take prudence alone. In fact, Smith, in his later life, re-edited the theory of moral sentiments. And 6 months before he died, he added a whole new chapter on ethics, and came up with the phrase, we need, over the course of our lifetimes, to develop superior prudence, which is the concern for others in our lives. So Smith saw self-interest as something that operated within a system of other virtues, and it's a balancing act. So you have to be prudent, you have to look out for yourself, but it's within a system in which we are looking out for other people, and we're not taking advantage of other people. He makes a great analogy of a race. And imagine we're in a race, and he says it's perfectly okay to be ambitious and want to win the race. It's perfectly okay to run as fast as you can and exert yourself to excel. It's not okay to jostle the person who's running against you and to push them off of the track. That would violate the rules of fair play. That is not acceptable. So there's a distinction, someone who is greedy is only interested in their self. They're not looking at their proper role of justice in the society and their duties and responsibilities to other people in the society. Whereas a person can be perfectly self-interested and also properly balance their duties to others.
So, because part of what Smith does in the theory of moral sentiments is that he really does get into human psychology and how human beings are socialized. And so it seems to me that the greedy person is more of like a 2-year-old infant, or a 2-year-old child that's very narcissistic. It's all about the child and all about what they want. But Smith talks about this notion of fellow feeling that seems to be something that is inherent within us, but then needs to be cultivated. And this is where I suppose we get into the whole idea of virtue, that virtues need to be developed and cultivated. So do you think that this is one of the most important insights that Adam Smith has about how we move from developing as human beings and then entering into markets, and how we're supposed to be conducting ourselves within this larger context?
Absolutely. Yes, I would agree with that. So Smith is perfectly aware that many people are highly selfish, but that isn't hopefully the norm, because as you pointed out, when you're a 2-year-old, you begin to learn your place in society, you begin to be socialized. And the mechanism of socialization is a human instinct that Smith says we have, that we can immediately empathize with the feelings of other people. And there are actually labs in Italy that found this mirror neuron system in the brain of monkeys, and it is believed that humans also have these same mirror neurons that enable us to instantaneously connect with other people. So that if you are watching somebody about to slap my face, you might flinch backward uncontrollably. It's an instantaneous reaction. And that mechanism of the instantaneous sharing of sympathy is what enables a child to learn self-control. Because the child has an innate instinct to please the parent. And to be in sympathy with the parent, and the parent is smiling at the child and saying how much they love the child. And when the 2-year-old throws their food on the floor and tries to hit their baby brother, then the parent is no longer supportive. Then the parent is scowling. And in every culture, smiling and scowling are almost universal signals of approval or disapproval. And the baby is immediately out of sync with the parent in terms of the sympathy, and the child has to learn something I did. They begin to develop perspective, and they can see themselves in a wider picture. Something I did caused disapproval of someone I care about. And that leads the child to begin to develop self-control. And that self-control is a huge part of what makes market systems work so well, because you have people who instinctively control their own behaviors.
Yeah, well, so as we're moving into the markets and we start looking at market dynamics, you've been talking a lot about the invisible hand, and many of our viewers might not quite be familiar with that. Could you explain to us about the invisible hand, and why do you think so many free market economists have sort of such a narrow view of this understanding of the invisible hand? Why they have sort of looked at it as pure freedom in the markets and not really tried to understand what Smith was really getting at?
Well, it's a great question. Adam Smith was very careful about how he used his words. He was a rhetorician. He taught rhetoric before he taught moral philosophy, before he taught economics. And the invisible hand was used 3 times by Adam Smith in 3 very different contexts and in 3 very different ways. So it's very complicated to try to understand what he meant by that. And I think the problem we've run into is that we have, I think as you said earlier, we've cherry-picked a sentence here and a sentence there, and we've added our own interpretations to it in the 20th century about what we thought he meant. So the 20th century interpretation is that greed is good if everybody pursues their own self-interest, that magically some social interest benefit is going to emerge from this. And I think that sort of misses the point. Adam Smith was interested in invisible forces at work in human society. He thought that moral philosophy would enable him to understand the invisible chains that connected human beings in a social setting and made society work. But part of that story has to do with the formation of institutions. So Adam Smith didn't think that humans left to their own devices to do whatever they wanted to do would produce necessarily good results. And that is because humans have to create institutions which are the rules of the game. So for example, we mentioned the instinct for fellow feeling, Smith also said we have an instinct that's in opposition to others. We feel resentment and anger. And out of that anger comes rules of law about justice. Mm-hmm. And it's not simply my anger or my resentment, but it's the sympathy that people have over many generations that leads to rules of morality. And so these rules of morality, the rules of justice, evolve over time. Mm-hmm. And it's within that context that we have economic behavior taking place. So it isn't that people are doing whatever they want to do. People are part of a society and they learn self-control to follow the moral rules of their time. Mm-hmm. I'll give you some example of this. Adam Smith lived in a time of a couple of financial crises, just as we've just lived through a major financial crisis. What led up to the financial crisis of 2008 were a lot of people misinterpreting Adam Smith's invisible hand to say we should deregulate all the markets. Yes. And people pursuing their own greed in the market will self-regulate the market. We don't need to have regulations or institutions. One of the prime proponents of this was Alan Greenspan, who was chairman of the Fed for 19 years. And there were other people who deregulated the financial system. But surprisingly, Adam Smith, I don't think would have ever said to do that, because in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith explicitly singled out the financial markets as an area where we needed to have appropriate rules and regulations. Mm-hmm. He thought that people could behave irresponsibly, and he's one of the founders of what's called behavioral economics, the idea that people don't behave rationally under all circumstances. So Adam Smith did not believe that we should just let markets run willy-nilly, that in appropriate places we need to have some regulations mm-hmm. in place. So the invisible hand has been misunderstood for a lot of reasons. It's a complex idea. It has to do with Smith's concept of human nature mm-hmm. and ethics. And as we talked about earlier, most economists don't read the theory of moral sentiments as a backdrop for understanding the invisible hand.
Mm-hmm. So as the invisible hand sort of works itself out in history, we do create institutions. Some of them are very good, others are not. Some of them are grounded in justice, others are not. And Smith was very critical of what he called the man of system. And it seemed to me that there were striking parallels between the man of system that he talked about in terms of being able to move pieces around on a giant chessboard, and some of the problems that we're having today with major corporations. So would you care to comment on how we can look at Smith's work and really see how this applies today, and how we can use that to sort of help correct some of these institutions? Because one of the things he says is that they are correctable. We can change institutions. They're not inevitable. They're not written in granite. And so we can do something to change it.
That's a great question. Thank you. So remind me to talk about the chessboard. I don't want to forget the man of system, but to go back just a step back from that, institutions matter, and one of these prime institutions would be property rights. What are the rules for owning property, dividing property, transferring property? Economists today are pretty much in uniform agreement that we need to have good property rights in order to have a working commerce system. There's a little bit of a paradox that in China they don't have good property rights, and yet their economy is growing the most rapidly in the world. So somehow they have other kinds of rules that are at work that enable them to function in a commercial system without having good property rights or a good legal system. And I think what they have are the rules of social engagement in a family or a clan. And that's what's helping them to create the trust that's allowing the markets to work. Mm-hmm. But property rights are a very important institution, and Adam Smith wrote about them in The Wealth of Nations. And in his day, he was not happy with the property rights. In his day, there was still primogeniture and laws of engrossing. Primogeniture said only the eldest male son gets to inherit everything. And laws of engrossing said the son can never divide up the inheritance, can never divide the land. Now, all of this was a very medieval practice that enabled communities to fight off invaders. Because if there was one clear line of succession, the oldest son, then if there were a battle and the lord gets killed in the battle, well, you know exactly who's going to be in command, and that person has control of all of the serfs and the knights under them. So it's a very clear way to defend yourself and protect yourself. And Adam Smith thought that the human instinct for survival was so strong that we would develop rules that would enable us to survive and to procreate and to be successful. So that's an example. Primogeniture and engrossing is an example of a rule that developed for survival and procreation. Mm-hmm. But by Adam Smith's time, it was totally obsolete and out of date. And Adam Smith was decrying the fact that there needed to be a change in the moral imagination. People had to see that this was no longer working for the society. Mm-hmm. So if you go with Adam Smith and you realize that property rights and the rules of commerce that we call trade can change and ought to change, then that leads us to where Smith wanted them to change. He wanted to eradicate slavery, mm-hmm. which is a change in property rights. And it's not too far of a reach from that to say women ought to have the right to own property.
Well, so, we're just about out of time, and I'm so sorry, because this has just been fascinating. But your book is absolutely fabulous. It's a wonderful book. And I guess my last, if I have a moment to ask you, if you were to give some advice to business schools as we move forward and using Adam Smith, what kind of advice would you give them? Would it be, look, you really do need to read both, that they really are companion pieces? Should we have these kind of forums where we bring other disciplines in to really look at Adam Smith as a thinker, as a moral philosopher and economist?
I would totally agree with that. Yes, an interdisciplinary approach to Adam Smith in an ethics class, in an ethical context, I think is really wonderful. And the main thing that I think it would leave us with is to think about the role of the passion. I mean, Adam Smith was interested in moral imagination. And it's kind of you're driven to feel these instincts with other people and to get inside their heads and to be passionate about what's going on in the world around you. And that is what's going to lead to transformation and growth in the business community. Business can be a vehicle for unleashing the passions and the moral imagination. It does not have to be a top-down system where the leaders at the top dictate to the workers. I think that's so passé. I think we're living in a world in which workers can be empowered to live out their dreams in a business world. And
so we really can't separate business from ethics
I don't think so.
As many business people try to do. Okay.
We cannot. That's
okay.
Correct.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wight, for joining us today and talking about Adam Smith. And as I say, Saving Adam Smith, A Tale of Wealth, Virtue, and Transformation is an excellent book, highly recommended for the student who'd just like to learn a little bit more about Adam Smith in a way that's not so intimidating. So highly recommend it. So thank you for joining us today in our community forum, and have a great day.